James Farr here, live from Pasadena Media Studios. Get ready for more piercing and provocative. The Conversation Live starts now. And welcome to another episode of The Conversation Live. The Conversation Live focuses on social justice, restorative justice, inclusion, and equality. Coming up today, I have a very special guest in the studio. The Honorable Mayor Terry Tornick, the mayor of Pasadena, will be in the seat today, and we're going to have a critical and possibly uncomfortable conversation. We want to talk about the current affordable housing in Pasadena, cannabis in Pasadena, and also discuss his re-election campaign. But before we welcome the mayor in the seat, let's take a look at this first video. Let's set up some context to discuss affordable housing.
California is in an affordable housing crisis. In the last 10 years, we've built 80,000 homes a year, but that's around 100,000 a year short of what is needed. In 10 years, this adds up to a 1 million unit housing deficit. The average rent in Los Angeles is now $2,500 a month. This is out of reach for an ever-increasing number of people. No wonder Los Angeles' homeless population was up more than 20% last year. The median price of homes in Los Angeles is now at a historic high of $631,000. Buying a home is simply out of reach for 80% or more of Angelenos. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know we have to build more housing as soon as possible to have any chance of putting a lid on rising home and rental costs.
And welcome back, Mayor Tornick. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Looked forward to sitting down and talking to you for quite some time. And I wanted to have an opportunity, to introduce you to my audience. I mean, a lot of times, most people may only experience you on Monday night in council chambers, and sometimes that can be a bit contentious, depending upon which side of an issue you're on. But again, thank you for taking some time. I want to localize that. I mean, we saw a broader brush, housing and the shortage of housing. Right now, one of the top issues within the city is housing, be it affordable, be it housing inventory. How do we increase the production? I mean, what's the solutions where we are right now?
Well, I think, thank you for having me. I think that the housing crisis in California and in Pasadena is not something that emerged overnight. I mean, this has been a long-term issue that's been evolving over time. And so when you say, how do we fix it, it won't get fixed overnight. This is one of those huge regional problems, really a statewide problem in this case. Pasadena feels it particularly acutely because it's a city that traditionally has had a wide diversity of housing, which has contributed to the diversity of the population. Now, since the rents are escalating at such a rapid rate, and because Pasadena is such a sought-after location, people want to live here. If there isn't enough production, the inevitable result is that prices go up, and people who have lived here families that have lived here for generations are being priced out of the city. So you're right, it's a crisis, and housing-related issues are the number one issue that we deal with, I think, week in and week out at the council. The city has not sort of sat by idly on this. I mean, 11 years ago, the city of Pasadena was a trailblazer in terms of adopting what's called an inclusionary housing policy, which means that every new project that gets built in Pasadena, anything over 10 units, has to have 15% of the units that are as affordable, not market rate, below market rate. We just increased that a couple of weeks ago to 20%. But still, I
know some were asking for 25.
Yeah, well, you could ask for anything, but I mean, we had to weigh the reality of if you push the number up too high, you kill the golden goose, and nobody will build housing. And the irony here is, as much pressure as the state is bringing to bear to have us produce more housing, if we had put it at 25%, the State Department of Housing could have said, well, this is really a ruse. You're just trying to fool people. You're going to make it so tough to build housing that nobody will build any housing.
I mean, more, I guess, tougher than what it already is.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that we can never produce enough housing. It's fine for the governor to set a goal of saying we ought to produce 3.5 million housing units in California. It's not going to happen. It's a made-up number.
Well, let's look, I mean, here in Pasadena, because production is the issue and land is at a premium here. Like, so where would you put where would these type of developments go that could be affordable?
You put them on, to build something, you have to tear something down. I mean, that's the reality. This is a built-up city. We don't have vast tracts of undeveloped land. We have a few, and those are being occupied. The city council approved a 550-unit project in East Pasadena on the storage,
which I'm not happy at all about.
Which is a subject of controversy. But you ask, where do you build it? There's 550 units of proposed housing, 69 affordable units in that project, which have a market value of probably about $35 million. But people objected to it because they felt it was a toxic site and it was dangerous and it wouldn't be a good idea. Anything that gets proposed of any magnitude, bumps into something.
Sure. I mean, and I didn't intend on talking about Space Bank today because I know it's controversial, but have you actually sat with the neighbors, and the people who are really concerned?
Multiple times.
Okay.
I mean, I think there are some people that have objected to that project from the get-go because they didn't want to have additional housing in East Pasadena because of the traffic and the development. And there are other people, and so they're just using the site issues as an excuse. But there are a significant number of people who genuinely believe that the site is unsuitable, to have people living on it and as potentially dangerous. And for those people, we've tried to. We hired our own independent consultant. We didn't take the word of the developer for it. We asked questions of DTSC, the state agency that's responsible for toxic environments and mitigation. No matter what information is provided, the answers aren't satisfactory.
I mean, because 100% remediation isn't even a possibility.
There's no such thing as 100% remediation. People use that term, they don't even know what it means. Mm-hmm. But I think that what has been, this is a toxic site. The only way it'll ever get cleaned up is if the developer pays for it. It has to meet very rigorous state standards. I've been through that process in projects that I've built or bought. I know how rigorous it is. It's not make-believe. The opponents have relied on information provided by a particular person who I think is well-intentioned, seems to know what she's talking about. Let's just say there's room for disagreement, but I would put my confidence in the reports coming from DTSC, approved by DTSC, the state agency that's responsible and does this for a living, and the private consultant that the city hired that doesn't have an axe to grind, rather than relying on one individual.
But if the property does come back and there is some toxicity in the soil, and I mean, that could potentially affect people's property values.
Oh, come on. I mean, that is so, as opposed to having a toxic site permanently. I mean, the expert.
It's undisturbed right now.
Yeah, of course it's undisturbed, but it remains there. The very toxins that the opponents are concerned about will never be cleaned up unless this project is built. So I think what this betrays, I think, is a couple of critical points. One is that anything in Pasadena has a variety of points of view, and you have to sort of pick the people you believe in. What's distressing about this particular instance is how many people obviously don't trust the city, don't trust the state agency that's responsible, and would rather rely on a single expert than on the agencies that are supposed to be doing this for a living. So the lack of fundamental trust in those entities is troubling as a public official. The other thing that it betrays is that there are lots of opinions in Pasadena, and part of the reasons we spent the last two meetings, 3 or 4 hours at each of the last two meetings of the City Council, arguing about projects that have affordable units in them. Mm-hmm. One on Los Robles and one behind the Blinn House.
Some pretty contentious discussion.
3 hours, multiple discussions. Both of them were using the state process to get additional density in order to build. But it in a way, it makes the point that the state government is saying. It supports their position that local government can't be trusted to produce housing because there will always be opposition to projects, and the local officials will always be more responsive to their constituents and the voters and the people that are their neighbors than they will be to the principle of producing housing. So we in Sacramento have to take that authority away from the locals, because otherwise nothing will ever happen. If you had attended either one of those meetings and didn't know, the details or the subtle issues involved in that, you would say, geez, I think the state is right and the locals can't be trusted.
And I mean, I certainly don't think it's NIMBYism. I've walked that community and I've talked to parents and children that are in there, and that's what people in the immediate impact zone is concerned about, what that may produce. Let me check in real quick and let folks know. You're watching The Conversation Live. The Conversation Live focuses on social justice, restorative justice, inclusion, and equality. My guest today is the Honorable Mayor Terry Tornick. He is the mayor of the city of Pasadena, and we're having a conversation about some things happening locally here in the city. We've talked a little bit about the affordable housing as well as production of housing. I want to take a look at, I know just last week, ep28 cleared both houses up in Sacramento and is expected to be signed into legislation. So let's take a look at what that means, and we'll talk with the mayor on the other side, what that impact may be on Pasadena.
Okay, if you've been scrolling through the news today, you probably saw this headline: California approves statewide rent control bill. Now, before you tune me out because it sounds kind of wonky, listen up, because this is a pretty big deal. AB 1482 essentially makes rent control law of the land in California. There's only one other state in the country to do this, and that's Oregon. Under this new law, for the next decade, landlords will only be able to raise rent for an existing tenant by 5% after inflation. No more, meaning a landlord can't just raise your rent some crazy amount that no normal person can afford. On top of that, it will be harder for a landlord to kick a tenant out. They actually have to have a legitimate reason, i.e. the tenant isn't paying rent. Now, there are a few exceptions to this law. For instance, the rent cap will only apply to California apartments built before 2004. But mostly, you're probably wondering right now, all right, how is this going to impact me? In parts of the Bay Area, it really might not be that much. San Francisco and Oakland, for instance, already have their own pretty strict rent control laws, and this new law doesn't override that. Still, it's one more protection for tenants, and those for it say it will help with the affordable housing shortage. Obviously, those against it disagree. They say this law could make it harder to build more housing. The one fact we do know, the bill is passed. Governor Newsom is expected to sign it, which means come January 1st, rent control will likely become law.
Welcome back. I don't think there's been a more hot issue here in the city, over the last 16, 18 months, for different community organizations and advocacy groups at council chambers every Monday night expressing the desire for rent control. Seeing that this is passed, it kind of absolves the council from having to take action on either implementing some sort of rent control. How do you think this impact will affect our residents here in Pasadena?
Minimally. I think, first of all, it's not rent control. It's a misnomer. It's a rent cap. It's very different.
Sure.
And I think that the passage of this bill reflects the intensity, as you said, of people's feelings and fears and pain as a result of this increasing rent environment that we're living in. I don't approve of rent control. I think it's ultimately destructive of the housing stock and precludes, or at least discourages, new development. So I'm not supportive of it.
I mean,
this is a rent cap. Mm-hmm. Most landlords, in spite of the sort of horrific circumstances that are sometimes pointed to, and the sort of crazy increases that a few people may impose, most landlords don't increase their rents annually by more than 8%, which is effectively what this cap would be. What's more interesting in some ways to me about this legislation is the just cause provision for eviction. I think that's a positive step. And I think that, and we tried to address some of those issues in terms of our tenant protection ordinance that we've had in place and that we just modified a couple of months ago. So I think, again, where it does absolve the city, as you say, is in terms of enforcement. It doesn't require us to put in place, as I understand it, a whole new department or somehow find a way to fund a bunch of new employees to do this. The city won't be responsible for enforcing this. But I don't think this is really going to reduce the pressure on the part of those that believe that we should have actually rigorous rent control in Pasadena or elsewhere. So I expect that this will continue to sort of rage. This discussion will continue to rage.
Well, I kind of want to back up a little bit because you said that, you kind of said like what a few people are experiencing in terms of rent increases with it
8% or more.
8% or more. And I know when I was researching for a story, cover story that I wrote for Pasadena Weekly last month, I talked to at least 20 people. And after hearing one story and then hearing story 19 and story 20, they all started to sound the same, in the sense that now 20 may be a few, but those are 20 actual people who.
Oh, I'm not I recognize that. That's, purely anecdotal information, and with all due respect. If we can track what's happened to average rent, to median rent in Pasadena, what's happened in LA County, and what's happened in California, and for the most part, it's not more than 8% a year. So I'm not suggesting that no one has experienced that, but I think there are more people that are probably going to benefit from the just cause eviction portion of the bill than from the actual rent cap. The problem with all of this legislation, when you start to intervene in the marketplace, as well-intentioned as your intervention may be, because people are feeling the pain and they want you to do something, the problem is that sometimes it has unintended consequences. So landlords will be tempted to, even if they weren't intending to necessarily impose, a significant rent increase, some of them will have the feeling, well, I better increase it 8% a year, whatever the maximum is every year, or else I won't have an opportunity to do it. Ultimately, what will put a brake on the rate of rent increases is the market. And we're starting to see a little bit more vacancy appear in Pasadena. As we have more production, it will take some of the heat out of the market. But I think the virtue of this is that it's a statewide solution, as opposed to sort of pitting one community against another. And so, from that point of view, I think it's a good thing.
Do you, when you're sitting up on the dais and you're hearing people every Monday night, and some of the stories that you hear in the 3 minutes of time that they're allotted, I mean, are you affected by it personally, or is it just all governance and policy?
No, listen, first of all, the only time I hear it is not on Monday night in 3-minute increments. I mean, people have access to me,
sure,
at Vons and everywhere else in the city. So people are not shy about telling me what they're experiencing. I know what's happening in the marketplace. I mean, it's the way I've earned my living, for a long time. So no, I'm not immune to it. I understand very well, and I understand the intentions of people that are, they're desperate. People are desperate. They get a rent increase that they can't possibly sustain. They want to be in Pasadena. Their families have lived in Pasadena, for generations, and they're asking, what's going on here? Why can't you stop it? I mean, me. They don't point to you. They point to me.
They point to you.
Anytime you have to get involved in a explanation, a sort of a technical explanation when people's lives are hanging in the balance, it's not a satisfactory response. So yeah, I'm affected. I mean, I grew up in Brooklyn in a rent-controlled apartment, and when I first got married and was in the marketplace looking for an apartment in rent-controlled New York, I saw what that meant in terms of distortions in the marketplace and having to bribe landlords to get in, and little old ladies that were living in 8-room apartments on the Upper West Side, and the disinvestment of people who weren't willing to maintain their properties because they couldn't come out. The math wouldn't come out, and the rent control bureaucracy was too heavy. So this is not an abstraction for me. I understand how rent control works, what its implications are. I'm a student of the subject, and every serious analysis that's ever been done in terms of economists and experts in housing have come to the conclusion that rent control causes more damage than it does good.
And some would disagree, but
well, they're climate deniers too, right?
You're watching The Conversation Live. The Conversation Live is focused on social justice, restorative justice, inclusion, and equality. My guest today is the Honorable Mayor Terry Tornick of Pasadena, and we're just having a conversation about issues here in the city. And I want to kind of power through some things as we're kind of coming up hard on the time, Mayor. You're getting ready to run. Well, you've already announced that you're running for re-election in 2020. And as of now, you've officially filed papers, and there's one other candidate, Major Williams. We don't know if anyone else is going to enter the race, but right now it looks like you two are all we got. So let's take a look back at your campaign, debate that you had back in the 2016, and we want to talk about development and building and some of your strategies around developers and builders in the city. Let's roll that package in, Jared.
I have the good fortune of being one of multiple city council people who represent the downtown district, which is a subject that's sensitive to some people here. But I've taken advantage of that opportunity in terms of participating in each and every one of the discussions depicted on the boards that are out in the other room.
And welcome back. So back then you guys were talking about development in the city, and you talked about even developing from the community up and having the community more involved in kind of the decision-making process. So the other side of that is some in the community think you're too developer-friendly. Which is kind of the leadership that you're going to go forward in the next election cycle?
Well, I think it's there are some people that believe anything. I mean, when you say some people believe I'm too development-oriented, we went through a multi-year process to try to find the sweet spot in terms of how much development is appropriate for the city. There are some people that feel that we should pull up the drawbridge, not have a single new thing built in Pasadena, and are not going to be satisfied if anything new gets built. I don't think that's a viable strategy, and in point of fact, it doesn't comply with state law. But apart from that, I think that cities have to continue to grow to a certain extent because it's what keeps cities vital and alive and provides opportunity for people. I mean, where are our kids or our grandkids going to live if we don't allow any more housing to be built? So we've had a very careful and controlled development policy in this city. We concentrated in certain areas in downtown and on arterial streets so that we could make a commitment to the single-family neighbors that they'd be protected. And that's exactly the strategy that we've been following. We put caps in each of the districts about how many new units could be built. We haven't exceeded those caps or even approached them. And in fact, now the new state legislation, another bill that passed, 1330, may blow up those caps. We may not have an opportunity to provide those caps. So I am unabashedly in favor of some new development, smart growth. I think it provides opportunities and allows the city to thrive, but I don't think we're overbuilding. On a 10-year basis, we've added less than 1% a year of new units, a new population in this city, and people that construe this as sort of reckless overdevelopment just haven't really done the math or really looked at what the facts are.
Yeah, I mean, I think the landscape is changing, and what people are used to seeing is changing, so that's obviously of concern to some, and to others, they see it as a city maturing and evolving. I wanted to, because we're really short on time, I wanted to make sure that I had a chance to get to some questions from some folks who had submitted them through our Pasadena Politics page and some other forums. Yada yada, and this really says yada yada. What do you consider your best 3 accomplishments so far, and what are your top 3 priorities if you're reelected?
Well, I think the most important thing that I've worked on is the fiscal health of the city. It's boring, but I think it's if the city's not in good financial shape, nothing else happens. And so I've really focused on making sure that we can live within our means. This isn't Washington. We don't get to print money, if we're short. So if we're going to provide the kinds of services that people want and demand in Pasadena, we've got to have a way to pay for it. So I championed the idea of measures I and J, which is, as you know, an increase in the sales tax, and people in Pasadena were willing to impose an additional tax on themselves. I also suggested that we give 1/3 of that to the PUSD, the public school district, and the people approved that by 72%, even though so many people don't have kids or have kids in private school in Pasadena. So I would say my budgetary focus, supporting the public schools, and the environmental issues, particularly championing some important changes in the Arroyo, are 3 of my most significant areas of concentration that I'm proud of. And part of the reason that I decided to run for re-election is that some of these enterprises, some of these efforts that I've launched aren't fully cooked enough. I mean, I'm not going to be mayor forever, but I would like to be mayor for 1 more term so that I can begin to make sure that some of these principles that I've helped to establish really are well inculcated in the city.
Yeah, because your last campaign slogan was "Keep Pasadena Great," and
my new slogan is "Move Pasadena Forward."
Move Pasadena forward. Do you plan on debating Major Williams?
I'll debate everybody.
Okay. Last question from John P. Not Perez, but John P. This new cannabis measure that went before you the other night and is slated to go either to ballot. Have you changed your position on cannabis? You've been a strong opponent for how it came into the city.
No, the people have voted on this already. This proposal that came to the council would undo what the people have already voted on with a 2/3 majority. So, I mean, if we want to have people vote on it again, I'm okay with that. I think we'll have the same result. I don't think people want to enshrine illegal operations.
Okay. Mayor Tornick, thank you so much. We're hard up on the time and wanted to get a few more things in there, but I got to keep your schedule, and I do appreciate you coming again. You're watching The Conversation Live. The Conversation Live focuses on social justice, restorative justice. Today, my guest has been the Mayor, Terry Tornick of the city of Pasadena. We've had a critical, not too uncomfortable, but like I said, I wanted to have him on, get a chance to introduce him to our audience here in The Conversation Live. Until we have another opportunity to speak with you, as always, agape. The Conversation Live is brought to you by